Good morning. Welcome to another Let's Talk with myself. I'm Oliver Joyce, who is best known as the game developer designer of the Swords and Sandals Gladiator game series, which you probably know if you're on this channel. I've made a bunch of other games as well, but those are my best known ones. This series is basically me riffing on various topics that interest me, mainly to do with games and game development, but occasionally pop culture and life, really. We'll see where it goes. Today in particular, I wanted to talk about my path to game design and development, and whether I think it's a great calling, if this is something that I recommend for other people. And I got a couple of thoughts about that, so I'd like to share them with you. You might hear off in the background some classical music that actually relaxes me and helps me think. It's really good for programming. That and the Tron soundtrack made by Daft Punk, which is really fast-paced sort of electronic music. It's good for coding. So first tip, if you're going to be a programmer, get some good non-verbal music that you can kind of just listen to, instrumentals. This, I believe, is Bach. It's an instrumental. So I'm not a huge classical music fan, but there's a bunch of songs I like. So all right, let's get started. This is a terrible instant coffee, but it gets you through. Another pro tip: get a coffee habit. It'll help you late at night. All right, so I've been programming for as long as I can remember. Probably age 6 or 7, I believe I inherited my dad's old PC. It didn't even have a hard disk. It had a bunch of floppy disk drives. And now each floppy drive could hold the equivalent of less than your average JPEG. And you had to put all your games on there. And so when you'd play a game that was more than one disc worth, you had to switch out the discs. Like a King's Quest game, I remember King's Quest 4 came out and it had 9 floppy disks. So you'd be going through this map, and then you come into a cave and it said insert disk 5. Then you go through the cave, you come out the other side and it says insert disk 6, and it was zzz, and you'd wait. I remember playing one of the first Ultima games, and every 4th or 5th step the disc would sort of load and access it, and it didn't matter. I was obsessed with games, and I wanted to know how they worked, and what made them. And what made them, of course, was just people like you and me. And probably the most instrumental device that ever came into my life was that machine and this book. Now this is Write Your Own Adventure Programs for Your Microcomputer. This book was written in 1983. It's got a cool kind of Dark Souls style cover, but back then no games looked like that. Nothing looked like that. They basically looked like this. Now you can see here, this is basic text. Basic was the programming language at the time. But the book was amazing. This taught me about arrays and variables and basic debugging and how to draw maps and grids. And a lot of games you see today still use grids not too dissimilar to this. You've got objects on screen, you've got walls and paths. Many games still follow the same tenets as that. So I remember devouring this book and really being inspired to write my own adventure games in BASIC. And then I moved on from BASIC to Quick Basic, which allowed simple forms of graphics. There was a popular game at the time called Gorillas, and it was 2 gorillas on a building shooting bananas at each other. It was like a very early version of Worms. And it was huge, and that was made in Quick Basic. Now, I was making these games for quite a while, just as a kid, just for myself, because this is pre-internet. That's how old I am. And eventually, there was no real market for it. I'd heard of, great men like Richard Garriott and Will Wright and Sid Meier and the very famous game developers, but there was no real path to that. And I think as a teenager, things became challenging because, not just because I'm a teenager, but 3D started becoming popular, and that was really out of the realms of what I knew how to make. People were modding things like Doom and Wolfenstein, and that was a path to become a game developer. but I wasn't really into 3D. And then a program came out called the Games Factory, and this is made by a bunch of French guys, and it was amazing. It allowed you to literally click and play games and make your own games, dragging sprites on and just writing the logic just with really simple spreadsheets and flowcharts. And I loved it. And I made a bunch of games in that, which I'm actually going to show you in a future video because they're kind of fun. And I made the mistake of putting all my friends in the games, which means you have a potential audience of about 15, because no one else cares. You've got your friend James or Crouch or, Steve or whoever, and that's great, but no one else cares who these people are. So that's another pro tip. If you're making games, make them for a wider audience than just your friends, because unless you're practicing. Now I made a bunch of games in that, and then eventually I ended up getting a job at a local store, selling computers and software. And I was I'd lost my way a little bit. I was making games in the background, and I'd put them on the computer screens at this place. It was a Harvey Norman, which is an Australian computer chain, which pretty villainous. They have terrible ads. But I was working there for a few years, making these games, hoping that someone would somehow discover them if I put them up on the demo screens of the work computers. No one discovered them. A couple of people said, "Oh, that's nice. What's that?" But nothing more than that. And eventually, the boss there said, "Ollie, look, you're wasting your time here. You need to get serious about your programming. Go to a technical college, learn, get out of here." And that really stuck with me. And so I left, went and did a technical course on multimedia computing at the time, CD-ROMs, and I learned a program called Director. And that was pretty cool because you had a lot more access to filters and basically shaders and music and all these things you could put into your game that were no longer possible. And I half made a text adventure, almost like a King's Quest style game in that before I gave up. And I was using 3D programs to render the characters. Anyway, sidetracked. So Director was made by a company called Macromedia. Each sip is worse than the last. So Macromedia also made a very influential program by the name of Flash. Now, when I was in my early 20s, Flash just swept through the internet, because prior to Flash, the internet was a very static, boring place with, not boring. You couldn't say it's boring because you had spinning mailboxes and MySpace style colorful backgrounds and MIDI files and things, but Flash brought animation to the web in a way that had never been seen before, and to be frankly, probably hasn't been seen again, because HTML5 still got a way to go to catch up. And I fell in love with Flash. I started making little interactive animations with it, and then I tinkered around with a character which became a gladiator and became Swords and Sandals. And through my love affair with Flash and learning ActionScript, I got a job at a company making Flash games. And I was there for almost a decade and probably made something like 200 games. Now, that is a good thing and a bad thing, because about 7 or 8 years into my time there, Steve Jobs from Apple wrote a turgid letter just decrying Flash and saying how terrible it was and how it wouldn't let it run on the new iPhones. And he was wrong on many levels, but at the end of the day, he called the shots because Apple's his company. And so that basically put the death knell in Flash as we know it. And there was a long spiral downhill where Flash became deeply unpopular and other bits of software rose. And where I made a mistake is I spent too long learning Flash and devoting all my time into Flash and not enough into learning other programs like the rising Unity and JavaScript, which had been around for a long time but was now starting to be taken seriously to make games. And I basically got a bit stuck. So eventually the old company and I parted ways after we disagreed on many things, and I wanted to make a a Sword and Sandals game which wasn't. That was Euro Night, and that basically caused a lot of grief. And anyway, I left that company, and for a few years spent some time freelancing and learning other programming languages. So that's another pro tip. If you want to get into game development, try and learn as much as you can about 2 or 3 different programming languages and bits of software. And I learnt Unity, and I learnt JavaScript, and a framework called Phaser, which I'm going to get into. And I made a bunch of games. I actually ended up releasing a bunch of mobile games, probably 6 or 7 in about 2 years before I landed a job, full-time job making kids educational software, which I'm still at now, and I love. And it's this I use JavaScript to make these games in. And at home, I still use a version of Flash called Starling to make my games, but I'm learning Unity just to expand to make, I want to make console games. I would love to make some Swords and Sandals console games, and maybe some 3D stuff as well. So that's my background and how I got to where I am. I probably have learnt 5 or 6 languages over the years, Basic and Pascal and C# and JavaScript and ActionScript 2 and ActionScript 3, and I've dabbled in Lingo and Python. And I find once you've learned a couple of languages, it's easy to learn the others. There are differences, but the tenets remain the same. An array is still an array. A function is a function. It's really hard when you're getting started to get to grips with those concepts, but once you do, it really makes a difference in learning the next ones. So that's about me. Let's talk about you and your path. Right now it's 2018, and far and away Unity is the way to go as far as making games. They dominate the market. Most games you see on the App Store, most games you'll see on the Switch and the PlayStation and on Steam, chances are they're probably made in Unity. It's been around for a decade or more, and it's now getting really, really advanced and very, very professional. Best thing about Unity is that 1 or 2 people can use it, and big companies can use it. You can make simple 2D platform games, or you can make huge, sprawling MMOs and that kind of thing with it. I've been using Unity for about 4 or 5 years, not professionally, just dabbling in it, and I like a lot of it. There's some weird things in that I've struggled to sort of get my head around, but that also comes from spending so much time in another program like Flash and then realizing, hey, they do it differently here. My next Sword and Sandals game after Sword and Sandals Pirates will be made in Unity, and I'm looking forward to that, because that will really bring things up to the next level of, cool special effects and particles and all the things you come to expect. Now with Unity, you can basically just download it and run it for free. You can get access to tutorials and everything online. You can pay money if you want to get professional extras with it, but when you're just getting started out, you won't need that. So I highly recommend, if you want to be a game developer, start with Unity. However, there's other alternatives as well. So if you want to be a general programmer who makes games, the most popular thing around right now is JavaScript, and it's the language of the internet. So JavaScript and HTML5 on the canvas is the way forward if you want to be employable by more than just game studios, because it's interactive. It allows you to do most of the things Flash could do, moving images around the screen, sound effects, loading images. It's anytime you see a website now that has any kind of interactivity on it, it's probably been done with some kind of JavaScript framework. The framework that we use in my day job, not Whiskey Barrel Studios, which I work a couple of days a week, my other job, the kids educational place, we use a framework called Phaser, and this is probably the most popular JavaScript framework, and it's really cool. It's designed for making games, and you can do all sorts of cool things with it. It takes a little bit of learning that I find it's a bit slower to learn than Unity, but and the games that you make there are a lot simpler, but they're much more lightweight as well, and it's much easier for you to get a game up and running and showing your friends on a website in a few days with Phaser than it is with Unity, because Unity, technically you can make web games, but they're so big and bloated that at this stage it's not really viable, in my humble opinion. The third choice is Unreal, which is another very, very powerful tool. Unreal, of course, is made by Epic Games, who made the old game Unreal, and this is an enhanced version of that engine. Now, Unreal has been around for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years in its current iteration, probably earlier, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's only started becoming popular in the last few years. It uses a C++. Unity uses C#, which is a very, very well-known programming language that you can use to make apps as well. Unreal uses C++, which is a language that's been around forever. And you can learn Unreal by learning C++, or you can use blueprints, which are very simple to use, drag and drop, and you can make quite a lot of games with it. I think from my very basic experience with Unreal, which is literally just downloading it for a few days and mucking around, I think it's better suited to larger teams and people that are wanting to make very, very polished 3D games, things like your Uncharted's and your Tomb Raiders, because it doesn't really have a great 2D engine at the moment. It's powerful, and I've seen people do great 2D things with it, but it's not really designed for that. And I think if you get into Unreal as a solo developer while you're learning, you might find you hit roadblocks quite quickly. You might not, that's just my experience. And a fourth option is Game Maker by Yo-Yo Games. And now that's a great tool for making 2D games. Doesn't do 3D, but if you just want to make a top-down 2D Zelda game, or a platformer, or your own game that's in 2D, you will have something up and running in a couple of hours, and it's unbelievably fast and has great built-in sprite editors and sound stuff and everything. The one problem with Yo-Yo Games Game Maker is that it uses its own language called GML, which no one else uses. So if you learn this, you're only going to be able to use this software. You can't transfer your skills to other programs. I mean, your skills you can, but your programming language skills you won't be able to. So if you went out tomorrow and look for a game developer job, you're probably not going to find many game maker jobs. So that's the programming languages. My original question was, is it a good idea to be a game developer? Yes and no. I've been doing it for unprofessionally, I mean, probably still a bit unprofessional now, probably 30 or more years, right? I've been doing it professionally now for about nearly 20. And it's feast and famine. Like, most game developers, aren't the ones making the popular games. They're making advertising games, mobile games for casinos, games in browsers that you click on the little whack-a-mole type thing, games for local councils, interactive quizzes, not the fun stuff. I mean, it's more fun than programming bank applications, you know what I mean? Not as well paying, but it's not as glamorous as you might think. To be commercially successful, you probably will end up doing that. You probably end up making games for clients and other people, which can be very rewarding and well-paying, but creatively can be a bit bankrupt, because most of the time they just want what's popular. A while ago, everybody wanted Angry Birds, or they wanted a Flappy Bird, endless runner type game. Now, for a while, people wanted Pokemon VR style things, and now it's probably something else. People want a Minecraft or a Stardew Valley or whatever, and realistically, they'll say, hey, can you make Stardew Valley? And I say, sure, but it's going to take 4 years and a lot more money than you're prepared to pay. So be aware that if you are going to become a game developer, that's most likely what you'll be doing to make money. What I do is I spend half my time making kids' educational software professionally for a company, and then the other half working for myself at Whiskey Barrel Studios. Whiskey Barrel started in 2013. 2013, the end of 2000. So it's now my 4th year, and the last 2 years have started to become profitable, and that's because of Swords and Sandals. Before that, I made 6 or 7 games. None of them did anything. One of them was featured by Amazon on its app store and had 60,000 downloads in a day, but there was no advertising in the game, and that was it. That one day, really popular and never heard of again. It was called Captain Fishblock, and it's a cute little puzzle game. I'd love to re-release it one day. But for me, if I hadn't already had some success with Swords and Sandals way earlier in my career, I don't know if I would ever have made any successful games. So what I recommend as a game developer is make games, make prototypes, make fun little bits of software, but support it with another job. Never go into this full-time and quit your job to do this if you value having a roof over your head. If you're financially independent, great, quit your job by all means. If you're worried about money, even if you have the best idea in the world, keep your day job, do this at nights and weekends, and eventually get the game to a point where you can show publishers and other people, go to game conferences, and you might have a hit, you might not, but I've seen so many people basically leverage themselves to the hilt to make a game, and it hasn't worked out. Even though if the game was pretty good, nobody downloaded it, and then they'd invested a lot of time and a lot of money, and they were sunk. And you hear, sadly, that story way too much. So that's another pro tip. Keep your day job. And leading on from that, start small. Make a couple of small games. Your first game will probably fail just because you're learning. And it's not a bad thing. Failure is good, as long as you learn from it. What you want to do is fail quickly and then move on to the next game. So if you're making a game that's a little arena fighter like me, that I was making, just make the combat. Don't worry about all the other stuff, the shops and the tournaments and all that sort of stuff. See if the combat is fun. If it's not working, quit, move on to the next one. If you have it in your mind, I really want to make a racing game, just make 1 track and 2 cars and see if that's fun. And that leads on to art. You can hire other people to do art, and that gets expensive, and that's what I do for some of my art, and I also draw some of my own art, and that's why Swords and Sandals looks sometimes very professional and other times a bit amateur. But having said that is part of the charm of the series. Many people say is that it's doesn't take it too seriously. It has that weird sort of South Park style look, which I actually started doing long before South Park, however you know. Now you can hire other people to do art, but when you're making your first few games and getting into game development, you don't need to do that. There are so many free resources out there. You can get royalty-free art as long as you have to just be careful about if it's got a commercial license or not. If you're making a game for free, most of the time, no problem. If you want to release it commercially, just check the license of the art that you're using. You can use services like Fiverr and pay people $5, $10 for some quick sprites. That's a hit and miss proposition, but sometimes you get some great art out of that. You can go to Open Game Art and get like all the backgrounds you need, all the characters. If you want to make a little role-playing game or a roguelike, you can get packs of 100 chests and 100 swords and 100 monsters and that kind of thing. There's a wonderful developer from the Netherlands called Kenny, with a Kenney, kennynl.org. Now this guy is probably the number one resource for quick, simple 2D and 3D art that you can use for prototypes. And now every week he's banging out some new art, and he's just released a tool that allows you to make your own simple 3D props, which I think it's called Asset Forge, and it's about $50 or so, and highly recommend it. I've only tinkered with it, but already I can think of some 3D games I'd like to make using that art. Art is a big part of your game, but don't stress on it too early. Just make your game, see if it's fun. If it's not fun, move on. When you're ready to release, if you can find a publisher, if you believe that your game is worthy of a publisher's time, that will help, because a publisher will spread the word about the game and they'll help market it. They'll take a cut, but usually either your game is successful or it's not. And if you're making enough money that your publisher takes a cut, you're doing all right, if you know what I mean. If you make games and you find you're getting burnt out by them, remember to walk away for a few days. Go for walks, do other things away from the computer. Play guitar, or just have an outdoorsy hobby. Socialize. I find most stories that I hear about people burning out, it's because they spent 80, 90 hours a week on their game, and it's not healthy. The games industry is renowned for crunch, and that's not a good thing. And I've made sure that I've never worked in a studio that has done that crunch, and I never will. I don't plan to. I think game developers don't get paid enough for that kind of nonsense. And a lot of the time, a game will be successful, and then they'll just lay off half the staff, and it's just not worth it. So there's a lot of great things in game development and a lot of bad stuff. It's very creative. The hours are long. There is no other medium that you can combine sound, art, writing, design philosophy, and fun in such a way that I believe as game development. But it does have its pitfalls, and it's a volatile field. So if you want to be a game developer, just be prepared to have other skills. Be a programmer, and then be a game developer. Learn JavaScript. That's probably my number one tip. Unity is great for games. Learn Unity, but more than that, learn JavaScript. Learn a few other frameworks. Then you can be a JavaScript programmer who makes games at night. And then if the game's successful, you can quit and become full-time game developer. That's about it for today. There's a lot more on the subject that about the game design scene and what kind of games to make and so on, but I'll save that for another video. Thanks for listening. I know it can be a bit of a rambling rant, and it is a stream of consciousness, but I hope that it gives you a bit of an insight into myself and how I work. And if you want to follow along my path, be aware that it's challenging, but you can be successful. I am 40%, maybe nearly half there to be doing this full time. And I hope in a year or two, with a couple more Swords and Sandals games on my belt, I'll be doing Whiskey Barrel full time, and that will be wonderful. And that is basically achieving my dreams. And if game development and design is your dream, go for it. Absolutely go for it. Just be prepared to have a few more strings to your bow, because if you put all your eggs in the game development basket and it doesn't work, it can be soul crushing, and we don't want that. Anyway, I'll finish my now cold cup of frothed up coffee. It says cappuccino, but it's not. It's crappuccino, really. The next video I'm going to make will be another Ollie Plays, and it's not going to be a Sword and Sandals this time. I'm going to tackle a classic arcade game from the past. So until then, I'll see you again, and if you like this video, please subscribe and tell your friends, because I'd love to have more comments and more viewers. I really appreciate it. All right, bye.